The winds of war are sweeping across the Middle East, and Israel finds itself in the crosshairs once again. Three adversaries, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran, seem to be closing in, igniting fears that this could escalate into a full-scale regional conflict. But this isn't just a geopolitical struggle. To many, it feels like something bigger, something biblical. Could this be the opening chapter in a story as old as time itself? One that has been foretold in the scriptures of three of the world's major religions? Across the globe, millions are watching closely as Israel faces off against a confluence of enemies, and for some, the stakes are not just political, but spiritual. Prophecies about the end times, war, and global destruction are being invoked, leading many to wonder whether we are witnessing the prelude to the apocalyptic battle known as Armageddon. But what's really happening on the ground? What is the cause of the latest surge in hostilities, and how did it get to this point? And most importantly, could this truly be the beginning of the end? Number 1. Israel's history of conflict. The long road to today. To fully grasp the weight of the current situation, it's essential to understand Israel's long, complex history of warfare and survival. From its founding in 1948, Israel has been in a near-constant state of conflict with its neighbors, and every one of these conflicts has had a profound impact on the region and the world. The creation of Israel and early conflicts, the roots of hostility. The modern state of Israel was founded in 1948 in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime. The creation of Israel was seen by many as a historical necessity, a safe homeland for Jews after centuries of persecution. However, for the Arab world, the creation of Israel on what they considered Arab land was seen as a catastrophe known as al-Nakba in Arabic, meaning the catastrophe.
The committee had advocated separate Jewish and Arab states as the uneasy compromise. The plan was accepted by 33 votes to 13.
The Arab-Israeli War of 1948. When the State of Israel was declared, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, immediately invaded. This war, known as the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, was brutal and devastating for both sides. But Israel emerged victorious.
Additional dances. Britain's civic administration is expected to withdraw by May. Jews and Arabs will then govern them,
expanding its territory beyond the original borders outlined in the United Nations Partition Plan. The war left a legacy of bitterness and unresolved grievances that have shaped the Middle East ever since. The Six-Day War, 1967, a turning point. One of the most significant events in Israel's history was the Six-Day War in 1967, which dramatically altered the political landscape of the Middle East. In just 6 days, Israel defeated a coalition of Arab nations, including Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The war resulted in Israel capturing several key territories, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This not only bolstered Israel's territorial control, but also deepened the hostilities with its Arab neighbors, Jerusalem. The capture of East Jerusalem during the Six-Day War remains one of the most contentious issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel, home to the Western Wall and the ancient Temple Mount. For Muslims, the city is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. The status of Jerusalem has been at the heart of peace negotiations for decades and continues to be a flashpoint in the current conflict. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, Israel's vulnerability exposed. In 1973, on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, a coalition of Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The war caught Israel off guard and led to heavy casualties on both sides before the tide eventually turned in Israel's favor. Yom Kippur War exposed the vulnerabilities of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, and led to a reassessment of Israel's military strategies. The war also had lasting geopolitical consequences, as it led to the Camp David Accords in 1978.
December 17, 1978, Egypt and Israel ended 30 years at
where Egypt, under President Anwar Sadat, became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel in exchange for the return of the Sinai Peninsula. However, the broader Arab-Israeli conflict continued, with Syria, Lebanon, and non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah refusing to recognize Israel's right to exist. The modern-era peace treaties and conflicts in the 21st century. In the decades following the Yom Kippur War, Israel has engaged in multiple peace efforts and wars. The Oslo Accords in the 1990s offered a glimmer of hope for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but they ultimately failed, leading to the Second Intifada, Palestinian uprising, in the early 2000s. Israel also fought wars in Lebanon in both 1982 and 2006, with the latter conflict focusing primarily on the militant group Hezbollah. Meanwhile, hostilities with Hamas in Gaza have led to multiple military operations, with rocket attacks and Israeli airstrikes becoming an all-too common feature of life for those living in the region. Number 2. The current geopolitical situation. Israel at war with 3 countries. In the 2000s and 20s, the already tense situation in the Middle East has taken a dangerous new turn, with Israel potentially facing the prospect of fighting a multi-front war against 3 adversaries: Iran, Lebanon, through Hezbollah, and Syria. The question on many analysts' minds is, could this be the flashpoint that leads to a wider regional war, or even a global one? Iran, Israel's most persistent adversary. The enmity between Israel and Iran has been one of the defining geopolitical rivalries of the 21st century. While the 2 countries once had cordial relations under the reign of the Shah of Iran, the 1979 Iranian Revolution transformed the country into an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, and Israel became one of its greatest enemies. Iran's leadership has consistently called for the destruction of the State of Israel, and this animosity has only grown stronger over the years. The nuclear threat. The most pressing issue between Israel and Iran is the latter's pursuit of nuclear weapons. While Iran insists that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, Israel views a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. This has led to Israeli sabotage operations inside Iran, including the assassination of nuclear scientists and cyber attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. Proxy warfare Iran has also waged a proxy war against Israel by funding and arming groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. These groups receive financial and military support from Tehran and operate from Lebanon and Gaza, launching rocket attacks on Israeli cities and engaging in guerrilla warfare. Iran's growing influence in the region, particularly in Syria, has placed its forces closer to Israel's northern border, raising the specter of a direct military confrontation. Regional ambitions. Iran's involvement in conflicts throughout the Middle East, including in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, reflects its broader goal of expanding its influence and establishing itself as a regional hegemon. This has brought it into direct conflict with Israel, which sees Iran's actions as part of a larger strategy to encircle the Jewish state and destabilize the region. Lebanon-Hezbollah's growing power Lebanon may not be at war with Israel officially, but the militant group Hezbollah has long been Israel's de facto enemy in the north. Hezbollah, which emerged in the 1980s with Iranian backing, has grown into one of the most powerful non-state actors in the world. Its military capabilities rival those of many national armies, and it holds significant political power in Lebanon. The 2006 Lebanon War. In 2006, Hezbollah and Israel fought a month-long war that left hundreds dead and caused widespread destruction in both Lebanon and northern Israel. While Israel inflicted heavy losses on Hezbollah, the group emerged from the conflict stronger and more emboldened, gaining widespread support in Lebanon and across the Arab world. Hezbollah's arsenal today. Hezbollah is believed to have more than 150,000 rockets and missiles capable of striking deep into Israeli territory. Many of these rockets are supplied by Iran, making Hezbollah a key part of Iran's strategy to challenge Israel. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has made it clear that the group is prepared for another war with Israel, and the potential for a new conflict between the two has never been higher. A multi-front war. If war breaks out between Israel and Hezbollah, it is likely to be far more devastating than the 2006 conflict. Hezbollah's rocket arsenal is larger and more sophisticated, and it has built an extensive network of tunnels and bunkers in southern Lebanon. A war with Hezbollah could also drag Lebanon into the conflict, further destabilizing an already fragile country. Syria, a complicated front. Syria, under Bashar al-Assad,
Any war is ruthless, and when you fight terrorists, you fight them like any other war.
has been engulfed in a brutal civil war since 2011, but its role in the Israeli-Iranian conflict remains significant. While Syria's military is a shadow of what it once was, the presence of Iranian forces and Hezbollah fighters on Syrian soil poses a direct threat to Israel. The Golan Heights. One of the key flashpoints between Israel and Syria is the Golan Heights, a strategic plateau that Israel captured from Syria in 1967. Israel officially annexed the territory in 1981, though the international community has never recognized the annexation. The Golan Heights remains a highly contested area, with Iranian-backed militias operating in southern Syria, close to the Israeli border. Iran's influence in Syria-Iran has invested heavily in Syria, providing military, financial and political support to the Assad regime. Iranian forces, along with Hezbollah fighters, are stationed in Syria, where they have been involved in the civil war. This places Iranian proxies directly on Israel's doorstep, increasing the likelihood of a military confrontation. Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the past decade, targeting Iranian weapons shipments, Hezbollah bases, and other military assets. While Israel has largely avoided direct conflict with the Syrian regime, the presence of Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria means that any escalation could quickly spiral into a broader conflict involving multiple countries. The role of non-state actors and terrorist organizations. In addition to state actors like Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, Israel faces threats from non-state actors and terrorist organizations that have made the region even more volatile. Groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, along with other radical jihadist factions, have consistently challenged Israel's security, launching rocket attacks and orchestrating suicide bombings over the years. Hamas and Gaza. The Gaza Strip, governed by Hamas, has been a focal point of Israeli military operations. Hamas, which refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist, regularly fires rockets into southern Israel, prompting retaliatory airstrikes. The situation in Gaza remains tense. And any conflict between Israel and its northern neighbors could easily spill over into Gaza, creating a three-front war. The Palestinian issue. While the current conflict may center around Israel's northern borders, the unresolved issue of Palestinian statehood remains at the heart of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. The failure to reach a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians has fueled resentment across the Arab world, providing groups like Hezbollah and Hamas with a pretext to continue their attacks. Number 3. Biblical prophecy and Armageddon. Is this the beginning of the end? The geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East have always been intertwined with religious symbolism and prophecy. For many, the current tensions between Israel and its neighbors are not just political but spiritual, raising the question, could this be the beginning of Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil foretold in the Bible? Armageddon in Christian eschatology. The concept of Armageddon is most closely associated with Christian eschatology, particularly the book of Revelation in the New Testament. According to Revelation, Armageddon is the site of a final, apocalyptic battle between the forces of good, led by Jesus Christ, and the forces of evil, represented by Satan and his armies. This battle is said to take place in a location called Armageddon, often identified as a hill in northern Israel. For many evangelical Christians, the events in the Middle East, particularly those involving Israel, are seen as signs that the end times are approaching. The idea that a multi-front war involving Israel could be the fulfillment of biblical prophecy has gained traction in some religious circles, with believers pointing to specific passages in Revelation and other biblical texts as evidence that Armageddon is near. The War of Gog and Magog. Another prophecy often invoked in discussions of Israel's conflicts is found in the book of Ezekiel. In chapters 38 and 39, Ezekiel describes a great battle between Israel and a coalition of nations led by Gog from the land of Magog. This battle, sometimes referred to as the War of Gog and Magog, has been interpreted by some as a future conflict between Israel and its enemies, potentially involving nations like Iran, Russia, and Turkey. Jewish and Islamic perspectives on the end times. While the concept of Armageddon is most closely associated with Christianity, both Judaism and Islam have their own eschatological traditions that involve a final battle or confrontation at the end of days. Jewish eschatology. In Jewish tradition, the end times are associated with the coming of the Messiah and the final redemption of the Jewish people. Some interpretations of Jewish prophecy suggest that Israel will face a great war before the arrival of the Messiah, and that this war will involve many of the nations that are currently in conflict with Israel. Islamic eschatology. In Islam, the end times are associated with the return of Jesus, Isa, and the coming of the Mahdi, a messianic figure who will lead the faithful in a final battle against evil. Some interpretations of Islamic prophecy suggest that this battle will take place in the Levant, which includes modern-day Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. For Muslims, the region surrounding Israel is of great religious significance, particularly Jerusalem, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The idea that a final apocalyptic battle could take place in this region resonates with Islamic eschatological beliefs, much as it does with Christian and Jewish traditions. Is the current conflict a fulfillment of prophecy? While many believers in the Abrahamic faith see the current tensions in Israel as a sign of the end times, others argue that such interpretations are overly simplistic. Biblical scholars and theologians often caution against reading modern political events into ancient prophecies, pointing out that wars and conflicts have plagued the Middle East for centuries. Historical parallels. There have been many moments in history when people believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of end times prophecy. The Crusades, the World Wars, and even the Cold War were all interpreted by some as signs that the final battle between good and evil was imminent. Yet, the world continued on. The dangers of apocalyptic thinking. One of the risks of viewing modern conflicts through the lens of prophecy is that it can lead to fatalism or even the encouragement of violence. If people believe that war is inevitable and divinely ordained, they may be less inclined to seek peace or compromise. Religious extremism on all sides has been fueled by apocalyptic rhetoric, and this can make the situation in the Middle East even more volatile. Number 4. The role of international powers. How the US, Russia, and others could shape the conflict. The Middle East has long been a stage for the world's great powers to exert influence, and any conflict involving Israel is likely to draw in global players like the United States, Russia, China, and members of the European Union. These nations have deep strategic, economic, and military interests in the region, and their involvement could determine whether the current tensions escalate into a full-scale regional war. The United States, Israel's closest ally. The relationship between the United States and Israel is one of the most enduring alliances in modern geopolitics. Since the creation of Israel in 1948, the US has provided unwavering support, both diplomatically and militarily, to the Jewish state. The US is Israel's largest supplier of military aid, and the two countries have close intelligence sharing arrangements, US military aid and cooperation. The United States provides Israel with approximately $3.8 billion in military aid each year, making it the largest recipient of US foreign assistance. This aid has allowed Israel to develop one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, including the Iron Dome missile defense system, which has been crucial in intercepting rockets from Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. US involvement in a potential conflict. If Israel were to find itself in a multi-front war with Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, the United States would likely be drawn into the conflict, either directly or indirectly. American forces are already stationed in the Middle East, with the US Navy's Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain and CENTCOM operating throughout the region. In addition, US support could come in the form of additional military aid, intelligence sharing, or diplomatic backing in the United Nations. However, direct US military involvement in another Middle Eastern war would be politically contentious. After nearly 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public is wary of further entanglements in the region. President Joe Biden has emphasized a desire to reduce America's military footprint in the Middle East, but a conflict involving Israel could force the US to reconsider its stance. Russia's strategic interests in the Middle East. While the United States has long been Israel's closest ally, Russia has positioned itself as a major player in the region, particularly in Syria. Russian President Vladimir Putin has provided critical military support to Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, and Russia's military presence in the region gives it significant leverage in any conflict involving Israel and its neighbors. Russia's alliance with Syria and Iran. Russia's involvement in Syria is closely tied to its alliance with Iran and the Assad regime. Russia has provided military assistance to both, including air support for Assad's forces and logistical support for Iranian operations in Syria. While Russia and Israel have maintained relatively cordial relations in recent years, the presence of Russian forces in Syria complicates Israel's military operations. Russia's military presence in Syria. Russia has established air bases and naval facilities in Syria, giving it a strategic foothold in the Mediterranean. If a conflict were to break out between Israel and Syria, Russia could be forced to choose between supporting its allies in Damascus and Tehran or maintaining its relatively neutral stance toward Israel. China's growing influence in the Middle East. While China has traditionally avoided direct involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts, its growing economic interests in the region cannot be ignored. China's Belt and Road Initiative has seen the country invest billions in infrastructure projects across the Middle East, including in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. China's economic ties with Iran. One of the most significant relationships in the region is between China and Iran. China is Iran's largest trading partner, and the two countries signed a 25-year strategic partnership in 2021, which includes Chinese investments in Iranian infrastructure, energy, and military projects. This partnership could make China a key player in any future conflict involving Iran. While China is unlikely to become militarily involved in a Middle Eastern war, its economic influence could play a role in shaping the outcome of the conflict. Beijing has emphasized a policy of non-intervention, but its deep ties to Iran could complicate its diplomatic stance if hostilities escalate. The European Union, a mediator or a bystander. The European Union has long played a role in mediating conflicts in the Middle East, advocating for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and promoting peace initiatives in the region. However, Europe's influence has waned in recent years, particularly as the US has taken the lead in brokering agreements like the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, in 2020, Israel signed the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. These agreements were seen as a major diplomatic breakthrough, as they marked the first time in decades that Arab nations had formally recognized Israel.
Comprehensive and enduring two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will be the foundation, the bedrock of such peace.
However, the accords did little to resolve the underlying issues between Israel and its adversaries, particularly Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Europe's role in the current conflict is likely to be limited to diplomacy, with EU countries pushing for ceasefires and peace talks. However, the EU's ability to influence the region is constrained by its lack of military presence and the deep divisions within the bloc over how to approach the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Number 5. The path forward. Is there a way to avoid catastrophe? With the Middle East teetering on the brink of a multi-front war involving Israel, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, the question remains, can the situation be de-escalated before it spirals out of control? While the prospects for peace may seem distant, there are still diplomatic, political, and military strategies that could help prevent the region from descending into chaos. Diplomacy. The last best hope. Diplomacy has always been the preferred method for resolving conflicts in the Middle East, but it has also proven to be one of the most difficult to achieve. The deeply entrenched animosities between Israel and its neighbors, combined with the religious and historical significance of the land, make negotiations challenging. The role of the United Nations. The United Nations has historically played a role in mediating conflicts in the Middle East, though its effectiveness has often been limited by the veto power of major countries like the US and Russia. The UN could serve as a forum for dialogue, bringing together representatives from Israel, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria to negotiate a ceasefire or peace agreement. Track 2 diplomacy. Another potential avenue for de-escalation is Track 2 diplomacy, where non-state actors, academics, former diplomats, and civil society leaders engage in informal negotiations. These talks can help build trust and understanding between hostile parties and lay the groundwork for formal negotiations. Military deterrence. The power of strength. While diplomacy is essential, Israel's military strength remains one of its most effective deterrents against its adversaries. Israel's military is one of the most technologically advanced in the world, and its Iron Dome missile defense system has been highly effective in protecting Israeli cities from rocket attacks. The importance of intelligence. One of Israel's key advantages is its intelligence-gathering capabilities, which have allowed it to preemptively strike at enemies before they can launch attacks. Israel's intelligence agencies, particularly Mossad and Shin Bet, have been instrumental in identifying and neutralizing threats from Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iranian operatives. However, military deterrence alone is not a long-term solution. While Israel's military superiority can prevent short-term threats, it cannot resolve the underlying political and religious issues that fuel the conflict. The human cost of war. As the prospect of a multi-front war looms, it's important to remember the human cost of such a conflict. The wars between Israel and its neighbors have left thousands dead and millions displaced, with civilians bearing the brunt of the violence. A new war involving Israel, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria could be even more devastating, particularly if it escalates into a broader regional or global conflict. The refugee crisis. The civil war in Syria has already created one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century, with millions of Syrians fleeing their homes and seeking refuge in neighboring countries and Europe. A new conflict involving Israel could exacerbate the refugee crisis, with more people forced to flee their homes to escape the violence. The psychological toll. In addition to the physical destruction caused by war, the psychological toll on the people of the region is immense. Decades of conflict have left deep scars, particularly among the younger generations who have grown up in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. Number 6. Conclusion. Is this the beginning of Armageddon? So after exploring the geopolitical, military, and religious dimensions of the current conflict, we are left with one pressing question. Is this the beginning of Armageddon? For some, the signs are clear. The growing tensions between Israel and its neighbors, the involvement of global powers, and the religious significance of the land all seem to point toward the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. The belief that we are living in the end times is not new, but the intensity of the current conflict has reignited fears that the final battle between good and evil may be upon us. For others, however, the current conflict is just another chapter in the long history of violence and warfare in the Middle East. They argue that while the situation is dire, it is not unprecedented, and that with the right diplomatic and military strategies, peace is still possible. In the end, whether or not this is the beginning of Armageddon may depend on your perspective. For believers, the signs are unmistakable. For skeptics, the conflict is a reminder of the fragility of peace in a region that has been plagued by war for centuries. What is clear is that the decisions made in the coming months and years will shape the future of the Middle East and possibly the world for generations to come. Whether this leads to peace or war, the stakes have never been higher.